Welcome, everyone, to the lecture Providing for the Afterlife in Ancient Egypt and Early China. So in this talk, we'll be comparing the funerary culture of ancient Egypt with that of early China. But for this kind of exercise, we first need to ask ourselves, why is comparison useful? Why are we comparing at all? One of the benefits of comparative study is to make what seems familiar unfamiliar, to break oneself out of the routine of thinking that certain things about China or certain things about Egypt are normal or characteristic of those civilizations, and to force oneself to think differently about the situation. This is related to the second reason to compare, and that is to counter the kind of hyper-specialization that is common in academic fields. In hyper-specialization, one only focuses on certain words or certain images and iconography and ignores the greater context of the mortuary culture or the society at large. So when we do comparative study, this helps us to generate new questions and to think about things in ways we haven't before, but also to reframe certain old categories, certain things like the word art or philosophy or science, which might be defined and have originated in places like ancient Greece, but may not be quite applicable to other places like East Asia. Now, one of the greatest benefits of comparative study is to understand one's own specialty field better. So through a mutually reflective analysis, one can actually understand each society better. It's like two mirrors facing each other that will mutually illuminate each subject. But how do we go about this? How do we compare two different societies? Well, in comparative study, everything is usually based on an assessment of similarities and differences, certain similar traits that they may have, as well as distinguishing certain differences. But how these are assessed, this determines the actual methodology of comparison. So in comparative study, we have certain variables that lead into each situation, and then certain outcomes, how things turn out. So you might have a difference in the variables in a situation which lead to divergent outcomes, or you might have a similarity of variables which lead to convergent or similar outcomes. Now, the level of analysis is also important. When doing comparative study, it's very easy to get decontextualized and to draw great abstractions or generalizations from the comparative case, but then lose out on the texture, the flavor, the lives of individuals, the things that make history and art history interesting. So it's important when you're doing comparative analysis to change your level of zooming in or zooming out of the subject so that you also get the fine details that make historical study interesting. Now, the method that I have focused on in my book and in this lecture was used by Bruce Trigger in his analysis of understanding early civilizations, where he compared 7 ancient societies. And what he tried to do was to separate out structural similarities, things that were constrained by the ecology, by the environment, by human nature, by evolution, and differentiate those from the historical particularities, those things which arose characteristically different in 2 different areas. There are also pitfalls to comparative study. One of them is what I call universalism. Universalism was a danger that was crossed early in the 20th century when people tried to write these universal histories like Toynbee's Study of History or Spengler's histories, where they thought that all human societies followed a similar trajectory based on a shared human nature, and that there was a universal story that could be told. Another pitfall of comparative study is to fall into the trap of nationalism and to read back the kind of national boundaries of China or France or Germany and read them back into ancient times and to constrict one's study to that bound. Another pitfall of comparative study is the idea of essentialism, and that's where one characterizes a certain society by an essential trait. Let's say all nomads are warlike, and this kind of essential characteristic then colors the entire argument. This is related to the last of the ones I'm going to bring up as far as the pitfalls, and that's exceptionalism. That when doing comparative study, one might just want to highlight why a particular culture is exceptional or unique. And this can be both in a positive respect to say, oh, British imperialism is exceptional and different than all other forms of imperialism, or on the negative side to say, let's say that Nazi Germany is an exceptional case and is different than any other totalitarian regime. So when we're comparing, we need to first decide, what are we going to compare? Which cultures are we going to compare? I would argue that any two human cultures of any time period can be compared. It only depends on what questions we want to ask and what type of evidence is available. So the time period does not need to be contemporaneous. If we think about contemporaneous, then we could only compare, let's say, the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire, which is very common. But in this talk, we'll be comparing New Kingdom Egypt with the Han Empire, which are more than 1,000 years apart. But time period is really not important. What's important are those kind of structural similarities, the similarities of society, of politics, of environment that make the two comparable. They don't need to be identical, just comparable. So within these two societies, we need to pick subjects to study that are comparable. So we need to make sure we have enough similarity that there are similar classes to look at, similar pieces of evidence to look at. And so in today's talk, we'll be looking at mortuary culture, which does have a lot of similarities between ancient China and ancient Egypt. And the kind of questions one wants to ask. So the normal questions one asks in one's own field have to be reassessed when we're bringing in another culture for study. And so the way we compare then is to generate these new questions that we can answer through comparative study that we might not be able to even generate the questions if we had only studied one culture. So if we look at the most apparent comparisons, what I say the more usual comparisons is to study classical Greece and compare it to the Warring States period in China. These are both time periods that have critical social and political crises and generate these kind of moral political philosophies that we see with the Greek philosophers and the Warring States philosophers, and these have been compared by scholars in the past. Another obvious comparison is with the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire, especially in the edited volumes by Walter Scheidel that have come out in recent years. The Han and the Roman Empire were both two mega empires at opposite ends of Eurasia. They are contemporaneous, they have nearly the same population, but there are some issues with this comparison. They're not really structurally similar in terms of their political structure, in terms of their environmental structure. The kind of comparisons we could do with Egypt and China would be to compare the Old Kingdom with the late Shang period, like Bruce Trigger does in his book, or in my book and this lecture to compare New Kingdom Egypt with the Han Dynasty of China. Now for some phenomena, such as the tomb figurines we will look at, we need to move to the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, because that is where the tomb figurines are much more prevalent, even though they still exist in the New Kingdom. So let's move on to our first subject, and that is the tomb models and figurines which are found in Egyptian tombs and in Chinese tombs. So there's many different issues we can look at in regard to these models and figurines. And here is a very fascinating tableau of a musical feast and entertainment from Wu Yingshan in Shandong, we see dancers and acrobats and musicians, as well as these elite men on both sides as the audience. So one thing we can compare when looking at these tomb models and figurines is what type of people buried these in their tombs. And there's actually a remarkable similarity in the two cultures between China and Egypt. The type of people in Egypt who buried these in their tombs were everyone going from the official class of people like scribes and administrators, anyone with authority over people, all the way up to regional governors and the king himself, the pharaoh. Similarly, in China, we see these types of figurines in officials' tombs, in middle income officials and scribes, all the way up to governors, regional lords, and of course the emperor himself. The function of these models is also very similar on both sides. In both cases, they were meant to provide food, to provide entertainment, to provide guards for the afterlife. And here we see in this granary model from the tomb of Mekhet-Re in Thebes that's in the Met, we see scribes who are writing down accounts of grain, and we see people dumping grain into these bins here, and real grain was included in this bin. Most of it's rotted away, of course. And so these figures would, in perpetuity, forever, provide grain for Mekhet-Re so that his spirit could eat in the afterlife. Because in both Egypt and China, there was the idea of a corporeal soul, the Ka in Egypt, the Po in China, which would remain in the tomb and needed nourishment. And so these models were designed to provide the food, the clothing, the entertainment, and the protection that these people would need, their soul would need, forever. Now, it was once thought that the only purpose these figurines served was to replace the sacrifice of real people, so therefore they were substitutes. That might be true in some cases, but it goes beyond that. They're not just substitutes, they are analogs. They are the real thing. They are meant to be efficacious. They are actually meant to work. Now, regarding the placement of where these things are put in Egyptian tombs and Chinese tombs, there are some similarities, but some key differences. Here we see in the Middle Kingdom tomb at Beni Hassan, tomb number 116, that the models here of a boat and here of a granary again, and here a beer making shop, these were placed directly on top of the coffin. Sometimes they are placed on the right-hand side so that the deceased would see out the eye panel, which is usually on the coffin here. But mostly these are placed on top, so they are directly in the visual field of the person in the coffin. Now in China, the models are not placed on top of the coffin and very rarely placed near them. Chinese space is more segregated by function and class. So we can see in the tomb number 1 at Mawangdui that the coffin is here in the central chamber. And in the northern chamber, this was a banquet space. And in that banquet space, there is a seat where the spirit of the deceased would leave their coffin, travel to the seat, sit down, and be fed and entertained by the figurines which were off to the right. In other spaces in this virtual house that the tomb represented, we have kitchens and storerooms, and other figurines were in these places. The musicians you see here were also in the northern chamber. So therefore, in the Chinese case, the soul of the deceased did not just stay in the coffin and be entertained and fed. They would travel to an appropriate place to eat, which was the spirit seat for the deceased, here in the northern chamber in this case, and there the figurines and others would serve them, feed them, entertain them. We can also see in this particular picture, another issue that we're looking at is materiality. So the figurines themselves, in the Chinese case, are usually made of wood. Larger ones, like the terracotta warriors of the first emperor, were made of clay. But in this case, the wooden figurines are covered with real silk. So we have a referent to the real material that you would cover these things with. So these are covered in real silk. The instruments of the musicians here are made of wood, but they have real strings on them as well. So even though the faces themselves may not be that realistic, there is a material echo of what they are supposed to be made out of, these objects and these clothing, which lends to the efficaciousness of the models. In the case of the Egyptian models, we also notice that the tools here in the carpentry shop of Jehudi Nacht, the governor who was buried in this tomb, this is really made of bronze. So there's an actual bronze tip here. And the wood in the carpenter shop are the real types of wood that these carpenters would work with: acacia, sycamore. Now, paint colors are also crucial here in that the figures that are painted kind of red here in Egypt, these signify people who work outside. So this signifies a lower class, a working class. The figures with lighter pigment, as we saw in the models from Meket Rey's tomb who were in the granary, the scribes, they had much lighter or yellowish skin because they were higher class, they got to work inside. Now we also notice something we can compare in terms of scale, that the scale of the figurines was relative, and this also determined what class they were supposed to represent. So in the Ma Wangdui tomb, this major domo here that was found in the tomb is much taller than the servant girl figurines which it was placed on top of, because he is their supervisor. Even in the terracotta warrior pits of the first emperor, we note that the generals are over 6'2", taller than the average person. The officers were a little bit shorter, and then the general infantry were shorter still. This probably doesn't represent the actual case. This probably represents a class differentiation based on scale. The largest figures from Meket Rey's tomb are these offering bearer figures, which are about half life size, much, much larger than the little figures that were in the granary. These beautiful female figures were probably carved in the imperial capital, in the capital of Memphis, and they were then given as gifts to Meket Rey, who was the former chancellor. And they were made of very fine materials, imported wood, and their scale represents not only their source, that they came from the king, but also their importance, because these offering bearers actually represent deified estates, these female figurines which would bring perpetual provisions. The other thing we note is that both in Egypt and in China, there is this idea of functional redundancy, that the people buried in the tomb, their descendants, were very concerned that they would not have enough to eat. And so they provided them with real food in terms of food offerings, real food offerings, but they also gave them models and figurines which would make food for them in perpetuity. And they also gave them carvings, like you see in this case on Jehudi Nacht's coffin. His carving is full of birds and fish and meat and all the things that he would receive. These images would make those food real. But then in the Chinese case, we also have real food, we have models, we have murals on the wall showing banquets and kitchen scenes, and we have tomb inventory lists, which also list the items of food and therefore could actuate and make these real. So the second subject I want to look at today is the tombs of scribes. So in both ancient Egypt and early China, the scribe was a very important figure in society. These officially trained scribes went to certain schools and they learned a certain curriculum of texts so that they could be government administrators, so that they could control labor and money and people. And literacy levels were very, very low in ancient China and in ancient Egypt. But the scribes were the ones who made the society work. They were the ones that ran the society and the ones that transmitted the literate culture of the past to future generations. Now, they were high enough level of officer that they also could afford a tomb. So I want to survey two tombs. Excuse me, I want to survey two tombs, one from ancient Egypt and one from ancient China, of scribes, and look at how they expressed their identity as scribes, but also compare things like wealth and other markers, ritual markers of the funeral. So the first tomb we're going to look at belonged to a man named Wa, who was the overseer of the storehouses for Meket Re, the man whose models we looked at earlier. So Wa's tomb was dug into the causeway of his boss's tomb, into this small little chamber. And here we can see just the way it was discovered in 1920. It was an undisturbed burial. And here's the diagram of the tomb itself that the excavator Herbert Winlock created. And so we can see off to the right here is a foreleg of beef offering with some food and bread and beer. And here is the coffin of Wa. And on his face was a funerary mask made of wood and cartonnage and gold foil. And facing him was this copper mirror inside the coffin. Past his feet are these wooden sandals, which are very rigid and probably non-functional, much like Chinese Ming-Chi objects. These are really models of sandals since they could not be used. And also to his right is this staff, which is either a walking staff or a staff of office. Now down by his feet is this beautiful little statue here, which represents Wa himself. And it's not only painted with clothing, but there's also a linen wrap on top of it, the kind of redundancy we saw before. So this is a Ka statue. A Ka statue is meant to be a repository for the Ka soul should the body and the mummy itself decay. So when the soul returns to the tomb to eat, then it goes inside this statue if there is no longer a body preserved. Now, when Winlock x-rayed the mummy, he realized that Wa was not a poor individual because around his neck were necklaces made of silver balls, necklaces made of gold beads, necklaces made of blue faience, necklaces made of very rare materials like carnelian and agate, a beautiful broad collar necklace, as well as 4 scarabs, including this one made of silver. And this one is important because it tells us who this person is. And so the inscription says, overseer of the storehouse, Wa. And it lists his boss's name, the nobleman Meket Re. And it's inlaid here with electrum. So this serves to mark his identity. Now the other tomb I want to look at belongs to a scribe named Xi, or Happy, and was buried in Shuihudi tomb number 11 in Hubei. This was excavated in 1975 to 1976. It consists of a coffin chamber here and then a head chamber or storage chamber where many other items were placed. And so here is a diagram of the tomb once again. And let's go through some of the items we see in the tomb. There were bronze ritual vessels, which are common in higher status tombs. There was here a bronze sword with scabbard, a sword being the mark of a rank-holding free male in Qin and Han China, and Xi, we know, was also an army veteran. Near his head was a lacquer toiletry box with a bronze mirror in it. Very similar situation to the tomb of Wa, remember, where he had a mirror also facing toward him. In the head chamber, in the 3rd level, there was a model of a carriage which could be used for post-mortem transport. Also in the storage chamber was this board game with playing pieces, and I'll be getting back to that in the final segment of this lecture. And on top of the body was this agate circlet, which was broken into several pieces and then placed along different points of the body in some sort of ritual. Now at his right hand and down near his knees, there was also writing brushes. And this writing brush, in fact, was placed in his hand as if he was writing. Also in the tomb, in the storage case, was another tool of scribes, which is a book knife. These were used to scrape off unwanted characters from texts. It's an eraser. But the most amazing thing in his tomb were texts. There were texts buried under his head, next to his head, between his legs, down at his side. These here to his right were legal texts, which he could have used while he administered legal cases during his career. So let's compare these different tombs. So first of all, in terms of markers of status and wealth, we see that both men carried certain markers in their tomb which indicated their wealth. Things like jewelry of Hua, the agate circlet we saw in Xi's tomb. Those kind of things are very universal. Money, jewelry, but also the tomb itself, its size, how deep it was. The Xi's tomb at Shuihudi is 5 meters below the surface with big wooden timbers. That's a very wealthy tomb. These kind of things are universal traits of status and wealth. Labor, materials. But there are also some that are more culturally determined, such as the bronze ritual vessels in Xi's tomb that have a certain history in China as indicating status and wealth, as well as the lacquer vessels, things like that. Now, in terms of personal identity, we have some similarities and some differences here. So both men were given some identification in terms of a written name. So in Hua's tomb, we have the scarab that lists his name as well as his boss's name. And in Xi's tomb, there was actually a calendar or a chronicle that was buried under his head like a pillow, which listed when he was born and all of the major events of his career, and of course, his name. Now, ritual significance, items that were used in the funeral or the afterlife, these are not that similar. These are more culturally determined. Things like the broken agate circlet in Xi's tomb is very particular. But there's also things like the Ka statue in Hua's tomb is also very specific to Egypt. But there are some interesting similarities. And these have to do with things like the sandals in Hua's tomb, or the walking sticks that were found in these tombs, or the carriage in Xi's tomb. And these have to do with an afterworld journey. And it does seem that there was a very similar type of afterworld journey that went on in both cultures, where the deceased was expected to travel through the underworld to the afterlife to some destination. But one of the most important similarities has to do with markers of their occupation or office. These men were scribes. And so it was very important to have themselves buried with indications of their occupation. So in Xi's tomb, he was buried with text that he worked with, and he was buried with writing equipment. Now in Hua's tomb, we don't have the writing equipment buried in his tomb, but in other scribes' tomb from the same time period and later time periods, they were also buried with texts, with pens, and all the materials that a scribe would use in his office. So the final subject I want to look at today has to do with paradise and its relationship to particular board games. So first of all, the question, what is a post-mortem paradise, meaning a paradise after death? So in both ancient China and ancient Egypt, there is this notion of a paradisiacal land, a distant land, which is hard to get to, and it might be guarded with gates or high walls, but not everyone can get there either. And access is restricted to those with the proper ritual knowledge or the proper piety in order to be allowed in. Now, once you get into this paradise, you are guaranteed a blissful existence without end. There is no danger, there is no evil, there is no decay, there are no wicked forces. Once you get into this paradise, it is literally a paradise. Now, physically, we see in these notions of paradise, there's always a lush environment full of enormous plants that grow many meters high and plentiful animals, unlimited food. Now, when you're in this paradise, you can do anything you could do in the regular world. And texts mention things like eating there, drinking there, having sex there, being happy with your relatives there. So you could be reunited with your loved ones in a paradise as well. Now, the other thing we can do in this paradise of ancient Egypt or ancient China is you can be close to the gods. You can be near to the gods like Osiris or Re or the Queen Mother of the West in China. And this gives you also special powers. Powers to transform, to travel, to commune with these gods. So before we get into pictures of these paradises, we need to talk a little bit about the nature of the soul in Egypt. So in Egypt, there was the idea that the soul was made of different components. So one of the components was called the Ka. And so here is the hieroglyph that represents the Ka. It looks like two embracing arms. The Ka was what made the person alive and not a corpse. It was the life force that gave power to their senses. And it was unique to each individual, even though it did not hold their personality. It was really a body double which traveled with you throughout life and was in the tomb at death, and it was the one that ate and received the offerings. The Ba, which we can call the individual soul, was another spirit soul, sometimes depicted as a human with a bird head. The hieroglyph itself, pronounced Ba, is the picture of a bird. And this soul was the one that actually held the personality of the individual, what gave them their consciousness, their individuality. And this one could leave the tomb and could travel among the world of the living and return to the tomb at night. Now, all of these things broke apart when the person died. Now, with certain rituals, these were all reconstituted. And when the Ka and the Ba were reunited with the physical body, they became an Akh, which is a transfigured spirit or an effective spirit. And this was the goal of funerary rituals in ancient Egypt, was to create an Akh out of the former individual. Now, the Egyptian cosmos consisted of the land of the living, the sky above it, which was thought to be held up with pillars, and an underworld, which was called the Duat, which the deceased would live in and travel through. Now, one of the places in this Duat that we'll look at was called the Sechet Iaru, or the Marsh of Reeds. And this was what we will be referring to as the paradise of ancient Egypt. Now, we will find illustrations of this paradise in the Book of the Dead. So the Book of the Dead is a collection of ritual spells, which is descended from earlier ritual spells called the coffin texts. But unlike those coffin texts, which were only found in the coffins of rulers and local notables, the Book of the Dead had basically been democratized and was found in the tombs of kings, nobles, and commoners alike, at least commoners with enough money to buy a copy. These are written on papyrus and usually in abridged selections where the deceased or their descendants would pick a certain number of spells they wanted and would have them illustrated by a craftsman, and this would be buried in the coffin, usually inside a statuette of Osiris. Now, these spells were often accompanied by illustrated vignettes. This is the famous Judgment of the Dead spell, 125, which shows the heart of the deceased being weighed against the feather of truth, and if the person proved to be worthy, they would then enter into paradise, and if they proved to be false, then this beast here would eat them. So spell number 110 of the Book of the Dead is what describes the Marsh of Reeds, which is sometimes also called the Marsh of Offerings, the Sekhet. And so it talks about, I eat there, I winnow there, I reap there, I plow there, I have sex there, I rest there, and I am powerful there. I am transfigured in it. Spell number 109 mentions things like, in the Marsh of Reeds, the walls are made of metal. The barley grows 5 cubits tall. The grain ears are 2 cubits tall. There are transfigured spirits there. Each of them are 9 cubits high. So this is a place full of enormous plants and strange creatures, bountiful harvests. Now we can see a beautiful depiction of it, of spell number 110 in the Book of the Dead of Ani, which is in the British Museum. So you see the whole paradise is surrounded by this ocean, the Sea of the Gods. And you arrive in this paradise on the bark of Ra. Here's the boat arriving at the inlet. And here you can see the tomb owner is working his fields here in the Marsh of Reeds. And here he is reaping his harvest. And here he is giving thanks to this beautiful, bountiful harvest in paradise. And here he is worshiping several gods. Here he is traveling in a boat. And here he is actually receiving offerings at his own tomb. This is his own mummy. And this might, in fact, be the ba form, the bird form of him standing on top of his own tomb. Now, in other depictions, you might even get the husband and the wife in paradise together. But here, Ani is alone. Now, in ancient China, there's also the idea that the soul is not just one part, but has components. And so the standard story is that there are 2 souls, the Hun and the Po. The Po soul is like the Ka of ancient Egypt. It's a corporeal soul. It's viewed as staying in the tomb or in the underworld. It's the one that receives the offerings. The Hun soul is viewed as lighter, and it floats up. It can go to heaven or other places, other destinations. And the Hun soul is sort of like the Ba soul in Egypt. It's the one that holds the personality of the individual, their intellect. Now in ancient China, there's different descriptions for where the dead go after they're gone. Earlier time periods, they go to a place called the Yellow Springs, which is sort of an underground area. It's not very well described, or another place called the Dark City. But from the Warring States on, it is said that they go to places. They go to a destination in the far northwest. And this western destination is near Mount Kunlun. And so Mount Kunlun is the paradise of ancient China. It's at the western edge of the Chinese world, but really the center of the world. It's an axis mundi. And it's characterized by a 3-peak mountain, which you see here on one of the coffins from Ma Longdui. And it also is surrounded by many gates and walls. And it's near a gate where you can get directly into heaven. There are trees made of gemstones here and incredibly tall crops. And it's also the home to this deity known as the Queen Mother of the West, which I'll be looking at in just a second. And here is where one can achieve post-mortem immortality, or deathlessness, 不死. So here's a description of this paradise on Mount Kunlun. We see manifold walls of 9 layers, and we tree-like cereal plants that are 35 feet tall, 440 gates. So very similar in its description to what we saw in the Marsh of Reeds in Egypt. So the Queen Mother of the West, this figure, is an ancient deity going back to at least the Warring States, but maybe further. May have been derived from Western prototypes, perhaps the Anatolian mother goddess Cybele. So she resides on a dragon and tiger throne. Here we see the dragon of the east and the tiger of the west. She wears a particular headdress called a sheng. She's often accompanied by a dancing toad, like you see here, which is associated with the moon, as well as this rabbit who has some sort of fungus or the elixir of immortality. We also see here the 3-legged crow associated with the sun, a fox with 9 tails, as well as these humans, these supplicants, this man and this woman, who are the ones who are asking for the elixir of immortality from the Queen Mother of the West. Can they have this special elixir that can help them to live forever? Now, the other thing we see is people playing board games. So in the presence of the Queen Mother of the West here, these 2 men are playing the game of Liubo, which I'll be talking about shortly. So the game of Liubo in ancient China, or 6 tallies or 6 sticks, requires this special board that has these marks on it indicating paths with a central square mark, and 6 pieces for each side, usually white and black, as well as throwing sticks that you would throw down to determine the moves. Players would sit across from each other and they would throw these 6 down, and that would determine how the pieces move. Now, we don't know all the rules to the game because those texts haven't been found or translated yet, but we do know the names of the different positions on the board, and that the destination really was to get to the Fang, to get to the center, and that this represented a cosmogram. This represented Mount Kunlun, that paradise that we looked at earlier. So that is why this game is associated with the Queen Mother of the West. This is a game about getting to Kunlun, getting to paradise. Now, these kind of boards were also used in divination, and here we see a board from the site of Yinwan where you can divine about marriage and whether your marriage will be successful or not, and you travel along the similar Liubo board, and where you end up depends on probably a throw of the dice, and this determines your fate in marriage. And here we see once again the Queen Mother of the West, and near her are 2 men playing Liubo. Now, in Egypt, the game associated with the afterlife was called senet, or passing. And the equipment consisted of a board with 30 squares, and one would travel up one side, down the middle, and then back the other side in an S fashion. And these could be beautiful deluxe ones like we see here from the tomb of King Tut. The pieces are of usually 2 different types, and those would be placed alternating on the board. There were also these throwing sticks here, which are often shaped like fingers, even with fingernails at the end, or you could use knuckle bones as dice. Now, the most important positions on the board were the last 5 squares. So as you work your way down the board, it seems that the goal of the game was to work your way off the board like in backgammon. And this was triggered when you hit the first square here, square 28, which had the sign Neferu on it, a good place, usually meaning the embalming house. But you didn't want to land on this space, space 27, which was a danger space, usually indicated by the water sign. This was some sort of trap which would force you to go back. And then the final 3 signs, which usually have 3, 2, and 1, sometimes birds, people, the sun, or even 3 gods, 2 gods, 1 god, usually the god Ra, the sun god, at the end. So it appears that the rules of the game were that you were supposed to pass up or jump over the other players based on the roll of the sticks, and you were supposed to make your way off the board without landing on the danger spaces. One of the ways we can reconstruct these rules is through this ritual text called the Great Game Text by scholars, which uses the game as an allegory for passing through the afterlife, and that in the company of other gods, you overcome hazards, you pass over your enemies, you knock them off the board, and you eventually reach paradise by completing the game. Now, we also see the game depicted in tombs. So this is the inside door of Senejem's tomb at Thebes, and there is an image of Senejem himself as well as his wife, and he is playing senet. But where is the opponent? He's not playing against his wife, he's playing against an unseen opponent. Well, I would argue that the opponent is actually on the other side of the tomb. On the opposite wall, there is the image of Osiris, and Osiris is presiding over the final judgment of Senejem as well. And so I would argue that Osiris is the unseen opponent, and this game is another judgment of the soul of the deceased. And if you win the game, just like if you win the measuring of your heart, then you are allowed into paradise. Now, these early notions of paradise in China and in Egypt had a profound influence in their area on later conceptions of paradise. So after the Han Dynasty, when Buddhism comes to China, there is this notion of a pure land. In fact, one of the pure lands is in the West, a Western paradise. And you wanted to be reborn here because you couldn't get enlightened in this world because it was so decayed. So you wanted to be reborn in this lotus pond here in front of the Buddha. And when you heard the words of the Amitabha Buddha, you would become instantly enlightened in this Western paradise. And so it's very possible that this idea of the Queen Mother of the West, paradise in the West, influenced this later notion of a Western paradise in Buddhism. Also, in the West, we have very good evidence that the notion of the Greek Elysian fields actually derives from the Egyptian concept of the Marsh of Reeds, or the Sechet Yaru. And philologists have gone into the words, and even the Greek words, which first show up in the Odyssey, definitely come from the Egyptian words. And we can see this depicted in this Roman tomb, where we see the very tall plants here. Off to the right, there are people playing games. And so this kind of paradisical realm, the Elysian fields seen in Greco-Roman texts, ultimately derives from the Egyptian concept of the Marsh of Reeds. And it even has further influence into the Christian period, into the notion of the kingdom of God, and what kind of paradise is the Christian paradise. So that's it for the talk today. Thank you very much for your attention.